11. Behold a Dictator, Fascism, and the New Deal. It is absurd to claim, as a few have done, that the New Deal, the basis of what we now know as liberalism, was identical to either German Nazism or Italian fascism. But it is equally absurd to ignore, as all our textbooks do, the fact that the New Deal and European fascism grew from the same ideological roots, produced strikingly similar policies, and fostered national cultures that, if not identical, bore the resemblance of siblings. Though we think of Hitler's and Mussolini's regimes as pathological, even psychotic, and entirely alien to our political tradition, in fact, they were organically connected to the most influential American political movement of the 20th century. The policies initiated during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency redefined the relationship between the federal government and American society. The ideas behind those policies overthrew the laissez-faire ideology that had dominated the nation's political culture since its founding. Most fundamentally, the New Deal changed American conceptions of the rights and responsibilities of American citizens. It brought about an age of communal morality, and made social order the primary value in American culture. The margin of freedom between the individual and society was at its narrowest in the Roosevelt era. Though many see the New Deal era as a rebellious moment when American culture embraced the interests of the lowest classes, in fact, like the War of Independence, abolitionism, and Reconstruction, it was one of the great anti-renegade moments in the history of the United States. The Great Army. In the summer of 1934, 1 year into his first term as president, Franklin D. Roosevelt was assailed by the left, the right, and even members of his own party. Leading Republicans took turns denouncing the new dictatorship in Washington. Typical was the claim made by the GOP Congressman James M. Beck of Pennsylvania that Roosevelt's New Deal had transformed the government into a socialistic state of virtually unrestricted power. Voices on the left were no less caustic. The Communist Party officially labeled the president a fascist. Also critical of Roosevelt's heavy-handed approach and radical New Deal policies were several Democrats, including former presidential candidate Al Smith and former Democratic National Committee Chairman John J. Raskob, who helped from the anti-Roosevelt American Liberty League. Of course, Roosevelt also had many loyal supporters. One of his admirers sent word to the White House encouraging the president to stand his ground and be proud of his heroic efforts in the interests of the American people. The president's successful battle against economic distress, wrote the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, is being followed by the entire German people with interest and admiration. The New Deal had many critics, but it would not have captured American political life were it not enormously popular. Roosevelt won 4 elections, all by a landslide, and the Democratic Party, whose platform was rebuilt on New Deal ideas, controlled the federal government for most of the mid-20th century. Industrial workers and African Americans moved en masse into the Democratic Party as a result of New Deal policies. A generation of intellectuals celebrated the Roosevelt Revolution. Academic discourse is still dominated by its partisans, and Roosevelt continues to be widely considered one of the greatest presidents in American history. But when the New Deal was created, few of its supporters in the United States were as effusive in their praise as were German and Italian fascists. In 1933, just 4 months after Roosevelt had taken office, the newly elected Hitler praised Mr. Roosevelt, who marches straight to his objectives over Congress, lobbies, and the bureaucracy. Hitler's compliments were not merely attempts to curry favor with the leader of the world's most powerful nation. Nazis continued to honor the New Deal as a project akin to their own. In January 1934, the Nazi Party's newspaper, the Volksischer Beobachter, applauded Roosevelt's dictatorial measures. We too, as German National Socialists, are looking toward America. Roosevelt is carrying out experiments, and they are bold. We, too, fear only the possibility that they might fail. Many of the most favorable reviews of Roosevelt's books, Looking Forward, 1933, and On Our Way, 1934, were written by German critics who saw the New Deal and National Socialism as parallel enterprises. In 1934, a biography by the German author Helmut Magers, Roosevelt, a revolutionary with common sense, lauded the New Deal as an authoritarian revolution with surprising similarities to the Nazi seizure of power. Through the first 2 years of the Roosevelt presidency, the Volksische Beobachter continued to find many similarities between Hitler and the absolute lord and master of the United States. If not always in the same words, the Nazi newspaper wrote, Roosevelt, too, demands that collective good be put before individual self-interest. Many passages in his book, Looking Forward, could have been written by a National Socialist. In any case, one can presume that he feels considerable affinity with the National Socialist Party. Roosevelt put forward the fictional appearance of democracy, but in the United States, the development toward an authoritarian state is underway. The newspaper praised Roosevelt's adoption of National Socialist strains of thought in his economic and social policies. Hitler himself saw a kindred soul in the American president. He told the U.S. ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, that he was in accord with the president in the view that the virtue of duty, readiness for sacrifice, and discipline should dominate the entire people. These moral demands which the president places before every individual citizen of the United States are also the quintessence of the German state philosophy, which finds its expression in the slogan, "The public weal transcends the interest of the individual." Dodd's successor, Hugh R. Wilson, reported to Roosevelt in 1938 that he had told Hitler that you were very much interested in certain phases of the sociological effort, notably for the youth and workmen, which is being made in Germany, and that one of my first tasks would be to report to you on how these were being carried out. Even as late as 1940, when it was apparent that Roosevelt was eager to intervene militarily against Germany, Joseph Goebbels's weekly newspaper, Das Reich, continued to insist on a kinship between Nazis and New Deal policies. An article entitled Hitler and Roosevelt, a German Success, an American Attempt, lamented that the American parliamentary democratic system kept the New Deal from becoming fully realized. According to the historian John A. Garrity, it is clear, however, that early New Deal Depression politics seemed to Nazis essentially like their own, and the role of Roosevelt not very different from the Führer's. Fascists in Italy were similarly impressed with the New Deal. In Roosevelt, Benito Mussolini found a comrade. The appeal of the decisiveness and masculine sobriety of the nation's youth, with which Roosevelt here calls his readers to battle, Mussolini wrote in his review of Looking Forward, is reminiscent of the ways and means by which fascism awakened the Italian people. When he heard that the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, of 1933, gave the president unchecked power over much of the national economy, Mussolini exclaimed, "Behold, a dictator!" Self-proclaimed fascists were not the only ones drawing such comparisons. Many of America's leading liberals and Democratic Party stalwarts were drawing them as well. George Sewell, the editor of the New Republic, wrote, "We are trying out the economics of fascism without having suffered all its social and political ravages." Oswald Garrison Villard, the publisher of The Nation, came to regret his early endorsement of Roosevelt. No one can deny that the entire Roosevelt legislation has enormously enhanced the authority of the president, Villard wrote in 1934. Given him some dictatorial powers and established precedents that would make it easy for any successor to Mr. Roosevelt, or for that gentleman himself, to carry us far along the road to fascism or state socialism. Two of the founders of Consumer Reports, J.B. Matthews and Ruth Shallacross, wrote in Harper's Magazine in 1934 that, if developed to its logical conclusion, the principle behind early New Deal policies arrives at the fascist stage of economic control. The New Deal's resemblance to European fascism was most striking in the first 2 years of the Roosevelt administration. Both Roosevelt and Hitler came to power in the depths of the Depression, and both argued that their extraordinary accumulation of power and the establishment of a martial society were necessary in a time that was as perilous, they claimed, as war. Turbulent instincts must be replaced by a national discipline as the guiding principle of our national life, Hitler declared to the German people in 1933. If you preserve the same discipline, the same obedience, the same comradeship, and the same unbounded loyalty in the future, then nothing will ever extinguish this movement in Germany. He called on all Germans to make themselves into a military force. Today, millions are pouring into our ranks, he said, but the greater part of them must learn now what this brown army has practiced for years. They must all learn to face what tens of thousands of our comrades have faced, and have paid for with their blood, their lives. In that same year, in his inaugural address, Roosevelt said this: "If we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline, because without such discipline, no progress is made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and property to such discipline, because it makes possible a leadership which aims at a larger good. This I propose to offer, pledging that the larger purposes will bind upon us all as a sacred obligation with a unity of duty hitherto evoked only in time of armed strife. With this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems." Roosevelt was probably not the only president to wish for such power, but he was the only one willing to demand it. Should the country fail to make itself into one great fighting force, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me, he said from the east portico of the Capitol. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. Roosevelt was the only president to achieve this power. 2 days after taking office, Roosevelt, invoking a national emergency, took an unprecedented step toward autocratic power. For the first time in United States history, a president closed the nation's banks. Then, on March 9th, Congress transferred much of its power to the president and gave him sole authority over a large swath of the nation's economy. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 was amended to declare that during time of war, or during any other period of national emergency declared by the president may, through any agency that he may designate, or otherwise investigate, regulate, or prohibit, under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe, by means of license, or otherwise, any transactions in foreign exchange, transfers of credit between, or payments by banking institutions as defined by the President, and exporting, hoarding, melting, or earmarking of gold or silver coin, or bullion, or currency. Congress effectively gave the President unchecked control over banks and financial transactions in general, and everything concerning gold in particular. More ominously, the new law allowed the President to alone decide when to acquire and exercise that power. The Roosevelt administration's next major step, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in June 1933, became the defining legislation of the so-called First New Deal. It created an economic system that was virtually identical to the national economies established in Italy and Germany, and further consolidated power in the hands of the President. In a stunning reversal of laissez-faire and a repudiation of the American devotion to free and competitive markets, the NIRA and the National Recovery Administration, NRA, which put the law into practice, suspended all federal antitrust laws.